Chapter 8. A Christmas Carp. Annika used to love October, almost best of all the months. The smell of chestnuts roasting everywhere on street corners, the school outing to the Vienna woods to collect mushrooms and berries, the drift of blue smoke from garden bonfires. But this year she saw the autumn not just as beautiful, but sad. She missed the old lady, and for the first time she wondered about her own future. Stefan, too, seemed less settled. He still carried his younger brothers about, delivered the washing for his mother, ran errands. But once, in the hut, he put it into words. "I don't want to end up spearing rubbish with a stick, like my father," he told Annika and Pauline. "Yes, but what do you want to do?" Stefan blushed. "I want to be an engineer. I'd like to build bridges." "Well, what's wrong with that?" "Everything. Even if I got into the technical school, I couldn't spend long training. My parents need the money I'd bring in when I start working." Because she felt restless, Annika's daydreams about her mother became longer and more detailed. She came now not in a carriage, but in one of the new motors like the Eggharts, except it wasn't garish yellow, but a soft and tasteful grey. She wore a hat with a plume and carried a sable muff, and the dog she brought had become grander too, a Russian borzoi, white and brown and black with a silken tail. But the words with which she entered the house were always the same. "Where is she? My long-lost daughter! Take me to her, please! Take me to my child!" But when the first snow fell, Annika cheered up, and in no time she and Ellie and Sigrid were off to the market to buy the Christmas tree. This was a serious business. The tree could not be big. It had to fit into a particular corner of the dining room, but it had to be perfect. And it always was. As they came out of the market carrying the tree, they saw Leopold with one of the stallholders loading an absolutely enormous fir tree onto a cart. Beside him stood Lommery, looking smug. "It's the biggest there was," she said with a smirk. "It's probably the biggest in the whole of Vienna." Annika stopped for a moment and felt a pang of envy. What would it be like to have a tree that would fill the whole room with its scent, its beauty? She imagined candlelight from floor to ceiling, a shimmer of silver and gold. But that night, Mitzi, the Egghart's maid, came round to see them. "Guess what?" she said. "The tree's too big. They had to cut the top off, and Lommery's having a tantrum. There's nowhere to hang the star." After the tree, Ellie and Annika began to make the gingerbread house. By this time, the professors had realised that Christmas was near and started to think about presents. On the grounds that the best presents are those that one would like to have themselves, Professor Julius bought Annika the new edition of Clodsberger Mesozoic fossils, and Professor Emil bought her the Encyclopedia of 18th Century Painting, which they gave to Sigrid to wrap up. Professor Gertrude took the advice of the lady in the shop and bought her a manicure set that included tweezers for removing facial hair. Then Sigrid brought down the decorations from the attic. They had been made over the years from scraps of silk, ribbons, fir cones painted silver and gold. But each year they made new things, and each year the sweets had to be wrapped in silver paper and hung on the lower branches so the younger Bodeks could reach them when the time came. In Vienna, Christmas is celebrated on the 24th, on Holy Night. But it is not a goose or a turkey that is roasted on this night of nights. No one on Holy Night would dream of eating meat. What is roasted is a fish, and not any fish, but a carp, the largest and most succulent fish in Austria's rivers. And just 3 days before Christmas, the carp arrived. It arrived packed in lumps of ice from the salt mines of Hallstatt, and the fishmonger had done them proud. "It's the biggest we've ever had," said Annika, and certainly the fish was magnificent, the kind that appears in fairy stories, rearing up out of the sea and granting wishes. During the next day, it was clear that Ellie had something on her mind. She and Sigrid talked together, and when Annika came, they stopped suddenly and looked at her in a considering sort of way. That night, just as Annika had got into bed, she heard footsteps coming up to her door, and Ellie entered. She usually said good night downstairs. Ellie's legs were tired by the end of the day, so it was clear she had something important to say, and she had. "We think you can do it." Ellie's voice was solemn. "We've made up our minds." "Do what?" "Cook it, entirely by yourself, without any help." "Cook what?" said Annika, bewildered. And Ellie said, "The Christmas carp." Annika came downstairs the next morning, looking pale, with dark smudges under her eyes. Ellie, too, looked as though she'd had a sleepless night. "I'm sorry, pet. I shouldn't have suggested it. You're too young. There's 10 things to go in the sauce alone, and there's the stuffing and the basting." Annika put up her chin. "Yes, I can. I can, and I will. Please would you get the book down for me?" So Ellie lifted down her mother's worn and faded recipe book, which contained all the wisdom of her family, and Annika found the page headed Christmas Carp. The instructions were written in crabbed handwriting in violet ink, not even by Ellie's mother, but by her grandmother, and they covered nearly 3 pages. Annika began to read. The fish had to be washed 4 times in running cold water, and the 5th time in water and lemon juice. At least 4 times, the book said. After that, it had to be put to soak in a marinade, a kind of bath of white wine, chopped onions, herbs, and lemon. It says here that Chablis is the best wine to use. Sigrid raised her eyebrows. "That's the most expensive," she said. "But it's the best," said Annika firmly, and Sigrid went down to the cellar without another word. By lunchtime, the fish was in its marinade, where it would stay for the rest of the day, and Annika had started to assemble the things she needed for the stuffing. She'd been given the main kitchen table to work on. Ellie prepared the vegetables and the desserts at the smaller side table, but she was beginning to suffer, seeing Annika heave the enormous fish kettle about. Annika's hands were red and chafed. She had tied her hair up in an old cloth. When anybody spoke to her, she didn't hear. Something was sure to go wrong, thought Ellie, and to stop herself interfering, she took herself off to the shops. By now, the news that Annika was cooking the professor's Christmas carp entirely by herself had gone round the square. Pauline, in particular, was very upset, and she came in after lunch, bringing her scrapbook of people who had done brave and difficult things, even though they were too young or too old or too ill. "There's one here about a girl of 10 who swam across the Danube to rescue her grandfather, even though she had the measles." But Annika did not seem to be cheered up by this. she had reached the grating stage. Grating honey cake, grating lemon rind, grating horseradish, grating, but only slightly, her middle finger. In the afternoon, Ellie returned and sent Annika out into the crisp snow to get a newspaper, thinking some fresh air would do her good. But this turned out to be a mistake, because the lady in the paper shop told her that her mother's stuffing for the carp at Christmas had always contained chopped prunes. Annika was unsettled by this, but then she remembered that the paper shop lady's family had come from Czechoslovakia, where they probably ate all sorts of things, and she turned back to Ellie's book. There was now only one more day to go, and the professors began to quarrel about the best way to stop the tree from going up in flames if the candles set it alight. Professor Julius believed that a bucket of sand should stand beside the tree. Professor Emil thought that a bucket of water was better, and Professor Gertrude favoured a large blanket with which to smother the flames. They argued about this every year and could never agree. So this year, as in other years, they took all three into the dining room. Sigrid polished the knives and forks and napkin rings and candlesticks. Ellie put the finishing touches to the poppy seed strudel, the chocolate mousse, the iced and marbled Gugelhupf, which is the most famous cake in Vienna. And Annika. Annika removed the carp from its bath and patted it dry and stuffed it with truffles and chopped celery and chestnut puree and lemon rind and grated honey cake and dark plum jam, and greased the gigantic roasting tin with clarified butter and laid the carp to rest on it until the following day, when it would go into the oven. There was only the sauce to make now. But there wasn't anything only about the sauce, which took up a page and a half in Ellie's mother's book. Later that evening, Frau Bodick came over with a blouse for Annika, which she'd stitched in her spare time, though where she got spare time from was not easy to see. But she too unsettled Annika, for Frau Bodick's aunt in Moravia had always added chopped walnuts to the sauce. It gave it a lovely crunch, Frau Bodick said. But Annika was determined to stick to the recipe handed down from Ellie's grandmother. Anything else would be cheating. And yet, that night, the last night before Christmas, she felt restless. A single word kept going round and round her head, and the word was nutmeg. Only why? Nutmeg was a lovely spice. There wasn't a word about nutmeg in the instructions for the sauce. Other spices, yes, and other herbs, but not that. I mustn't, said Annika again. I mustn't change anything or add anything. It's got to be the way it always was. The bells woke her in the dark of the morning of the 24th. She shrugged on her clothes, and then she and Ellie and Sigrid went across the square to church for early morning mass. When she got back, she knew with deadly certainty that lunch was going to be a failure. The carp would come apart, the sauce would curdle, the stuffing would leak. Fighting down panic, she went to the larder, fetched the fish, and put it in the oven. Then, right at the last minute, she did something she knew she would regret. The three professors were dressed in their best clothes. Their starched napkins were ready round their necks. Their eyes were expectant, and the table was set with gold-rimmed mason plates, which were only used on very special days. Then the door opened, and Annika entered with the carp. The professors smiled benevolently. Ellie brought the vegetables and the sauce. Professor Julius began to cut the fish into slices. Delicious, they said. Absolutely delicious, just as always. But when Ellie and Sigrid and Annika sat down in the kitchen to their share of the fish, the worst happened. Ellie put a helping of the carp into her mouth. Her face clouded. Annika had seldom seen her look so angry. "What have you done?" she asked, aghast. "What have you done, Annika? My mother would turn in her grave." She took another mouthful. An awful silence fell. Then Sigrid said, "Just taste, Ellie. Just taste, don't lecture." Ellie speared another piece of fish in its dark sauce. And another. She closed her eyes. She still did not speak. But when the first course was finished, she got up and fetched the black book from the dresser, and with it a pen and a bottle of ink. "Then you can write in it," she said to Annika. "Don't smudge it." Annika took the pen. "What do I write?" she asked, bewildered. Ellie pointed to the instructions for cooking the Christmas carp. "Here, under the last line, write, 'A pinch of nutmeg will improve the flavour of the sauce.'" The tree did not catch fire. Sigrid had made Annika a brown velvet dress with a wide lace collar. Ellie gave her a silver charm to add to her bracelet. Later, the Bodeks came, and Stefan lifted up the smaller ones to get their sugar mice and gingerbread hearts from the tree. All in all, it had been a wonderful Christmas. "Our best ever," Annika said, as she said each year and meant it. She'd quite forgotten her doubt and sadness. Her future lay clear before her. She would learn to be the best cook in Vienna, perhaps even a famous cook who had dishes named after her. Certainly, there was no better place to grow up here, in this familiar square, in the most beautiful city in the world. She opened her double windows, which she was not supposed to do, and held out a hand to catch a snowflake. Faintly, across the cobbles, there came the noise of a child screaming. Then the egg cart's door opened, and Lommery threw her new skating boots out into the street. "They're the wrong colour," she yelled. "I told you, I wanted them to be blue." And Annika, who'd prayed only that morning not to think unkind thoughts, felt this was the perfect end to the day.